The house clearly wasn't locked, yet these monsters disguised as humans still didn't dare to enter. All the woman could do was clutch the charm stone that warded off evil and pray she could survive until morning. Every nightfall, these creatures would gather in the town, feeding specifically on human organs. They wouldn't leave until dawn. To keep everyone safe, the sheriff would ring a bell before sunset each day. The sound was the signal for all residents to hurry back home, instinctively touching the charm stone by their door. Even kids as young as 7 or 8 would obey without question. It goes to show just how terrifying the nights in this town really were. Only after the streets were completely empty would the sheriff finally return to the station, reassured. On the wall hung a sign showing they had survived 96 days in peace. But little did anyone know, that streak would be broken tonight. A man had gotten completely drunk, and the tavern owner, having no other choice, locked up the place and let him stay the night. But the drunk had a wife and daughter waiting for him at home. As he failed to return, his wife eventually locked the door and went back inside. Midnight came. The drunk's daughter was just getting ready for bed when she suddenly heard her late grandmother's voice outside the window. Curious, she pulled back the curtain and, to her surprise, saw her grandmother standing right there. Her grandmother said it was cold outside and asked to come in for a bit. The girl was easily tricked. Even though her mother desperately tried to stop her, it was already too late. The next morning, the drunk man sobered up to find his neighbors gathered in front of his house. Before he could ask what was going on, the sheriff slapped him hard across the face. Turns out, the sheriff had warned everyone countless times. Households with children had to nail their windows shut because kids were the easiest to deceive. But the man ignored the warning, thinking it wouldn't happen to him. And that mistake led to last night's tragedy. Looking down at the remains of his wife and daughter, the man collapsed to his knees in guilt. But it was too late. He had to take responsibility for his foolishness.
Lock him.
The sheriff's anger wasn't just because the man caused his own family's death, it was because he put others in danger too. In this town, whenever someone dies, a newcomer is drawn in, and the safety of everyone is at risk again. Sure enough, on the day of the funeral, an RV pulled into town. The sheriff quickly told everyone not to speak to the newcomers and went ahead himself to ask what was going on. After learning that the family had gotten lost, the sheriff pointed them in a direction to drive. The man soon drove off, but strangely, no matter how he drove, they just couldn't leave the town. Watching them loop around again and again, the sheriff didn't seem surprised. He hadn't told them the truth on purpose. Letting them go in circles would help them adapt faster. Only by breaking through the first mental barrier could they have a real chance of surviving the night. But as the man kept circling, disaster struck. The RV flipped into the forest. The whole family was trapped inside. The man was pinned in the driver's seat by a tree, and his wife was unconscious, her condition unknown. Luckily, their daughter was mostly okay, just a twisted back. But their young son was in worse shape. Though still conscious, a branch had pierced through his thigh. Meanwhile, the sheriff was still setting up roadblocks to keep the area sealed off. But with the family not returning and nightfall approaching, he had no choice but to lead a team out to find them. When he found the family trapped in the RV, he jumped into action. Soon, 3 of them were rescued. Only the little boy was still stuck inside. Because of the heavy bleeding, the sheriff couldn't pull him out directly. He had to perform emergency treatment right there in the vehicle. But there were only 40 minutes left until sunset, and the treatment would take at least an hour. With no other option, the sheriff chose to stay overnight and sent the rest of the family back with his team. As the sky grew darker, the sheriff looked at the charm stone in his hand, placing his last bit of hope in it. Then he hung the stone on the RV. The man was confused, but the sheriff didn't explain right away. Only after sealing every gap in the vehicle did he finally begin to tell him what was coming. Just then, the boy started to convulse, and eerie howls rang out nearby. When the sheriff looked out the window, he saw the monsters had quietly drawn near.
They're coming.
As more and more monsters gathered outside, even the sheriff felt a chill down his spine. It was clear that surviving the night had now become their greatest challenge. The vehicle was clearly totaled, yet the black sheriff didn't dare to leave. The outside was crawling with monsters disguised as humans, so he could only place his hope in the charm stone meant to ward off evil, praying he would survive until morning. Suddenly, shouting came from outside the car, one of the monsters' tricks to lure people out, but the seasoned sheriff didn't fall for it. However, Jim, who was in town for the first time, became restless. He thought rescuers had arrived and was about to open the door, but the sheriff stopped him immediately. He explained that those outside weren't human at all, but monsters that fed on human organs. If Jim didn't want his son to get hurt, he had to stay put and wait for daylight. Once morning came, the monsters would vanish on their own. Hearing this, Jim finally calmed down. For the sake of his son's safety, he chose not to take the risk. But what he didn't know was that his wife and daughter, who had left with the rescue team, had run into trouble. The rescue vehicle had suddenly broken down, forcing them to walk walk the rest of the way to the safe house. But night had now fallen, and the streets were full of man-eating monsters. When the people inside the safe house saw them approaching, they quickly sounded the alarm. Everyone went on high alert and refused to open the door, no matter how hard the mother and daughter knocked. Because it was now dark, no one could be sure whether they were real people or monsters in disguise. What they didn't realize was that the real monster had already crept up. A teenage boy suddenly called out to Julie, repeating her name over and over. Her expression went blank immediately. She had clearly fallen under the creature's spell. Fortunately, the deputy sheriff reacted in time and fired a shot at the boy, but the monster was unharmed. Just as things were about to spiral out of control, the female leader quickly ordered the bald man to open the door, barely saving the mother and daughter's lives. But the moment they stepped inside, they were tied up. It was a procedure every newcomer had to go through, a necessary step to prevent monsters from infiltrating. Soon, the mother and daughter were separated and placed in isolation. The leader told the woman not to be afraid. Everyone here had ended up in the town by accident, and honestly, they were among the lucky ones. Some people arrived in the middle of the night and never had a chance to understand the situation before being torn apart by the monsters. But what the woman feared most wasn't for herself. It was for her husband and son, still stuck in the RV. Meanwhile, the shouting outside the RV still hadn't stopped. The monsters were even walking on the roof. The sheriff quickly reassured everyone. As long as the charm stone was in place, the monsters couldn't get in. He told them to stay calm, because panic would only give the creatures a chance to break through. Sure enough, things soon quieted down. But strangely, in the middle of the night, Jim suddenly got up and, out of curiosity, took down the charm stone. The doctor noticed and tried to stop him right away, but it was already too late. Turns out it was just a nightmare. They had made it through the night safely. Right then, the rescue team arrived. Seeing that everyone was unharmed, they all breathed a sigh of relief. But now the newcomers had to decide where to live. One option was to stay in the safe house, sticking together with others for warmth and security. The other was to move into one of the town's houses, which offered more privacy, but also more danger. If they chose to live in the town, they'd have to inspect their charm stones before sunset each day. And families with children would need to nail their windows shut, because the monsters often tried to trick people into opening doors, and children were the easiest to manipulate. Of course, the town also had punishment rules. If someone broke the rules and caused a resident's death, they'd be locked in the tin shack overnight. There were no charm stones inside. Anyone sent in was almost certainly going to die. The woman curiously asked how many times it had been used. The priest replied that it had never been used before, but tonight would be the first. After the introduction to the town and the safe house, it was time for Jim's family to choose where to stay. Everyone assumed the four of them would live together in one of the townhouses, but to their surprise, the daughter chose to stay in the safe house alone. Maybe she felt that her parents loved her younger brother more, and this was her way of acting out for once. This sudden decision left her parents shaken. They were deeply worried about her safety and tried everything they could to convince her to come back. But the sheriff stepped in, saying it was already late. Everyone needed to return to their designated places before dark. To ease their minds, the sheriff added that his own son was also staying at the safe house, and he would do his best to look after the girl.
Everybody, son, will be going down too.
At the priest's urging, everyone went their separate ways, and tonight it was time for punishment. Because the drunk man had caused the deaths of his wife and daughter, he now had to face the terrifying consequence, spending the entire night in the tin shack.
I'm ready.
Looking at the broken man, the sheriff could only add 2 more locks to the shack and silently pray he would make it through the night. But as the door slammed shut, the man's fate was already sealed. The man hadn't committed a crime, yet the neighbors still locked him in the iron box. The sheriff, though conflicted, added extra locks and left, hoping the man would survive until dawn. Because once night fell, the monsters disguised as humans would begin to gather in town. They fed exclusively on human organs, leaving only after the sun rose. The only way to survive was to stay inside a house protected by a charm stone, but without one, the man had no choice but to curl up in a corner of the tin shack. And when he looked around again, the monsters were already closing in. At that moment, the man was like a lamb waiting for slaughter. He shut his eyes, resigned to his fate. The next morning, when the sheriff returned to the tin shack, the area was a mess. The man had been completely devoured by the monsters. Staring at the grisly remains, the sheriff didn't show much emotion. He had long since grown used to scenes like this.